In the winter of 1857, 4 women vanished from a remote Mormon settlement in Utah Territory without leaving a single footprint in the snow. Their names were Sarah, Rebecca, Martha, and young Elizabeth. 4 souls bound not by choice, but by doctrine. 4 lives that disappeared into the endless white expanse of the Wasatch Mountains, leaving behind only questions that would fester in the shadows of American history for over a century and a half. This is their story. This is the story of Josiah Whitmore, a man who claimed to speak with angels, who built his kingdom on the bones of the faithful, and who made 4 women disappear as if they had never existed at all. But first, let me ask you something. When you think of the American frontier, what images come to mind? Pioneer families in covered wagons? Brave settlers taming the wilderness? The birth of the American dream in the untamed West? Tonight, I want you to forget those comfortable myths. Tonight, we descend into the darkness that religious fanaticism can breed when it meets isolation, desperation, and the kind of power that corrupts absolutely. The year is 1847. President James K. Polk sits in Washington, unaware that in the vast territories of the American West, entire communities are forming their own laws, their own justice, their own terrible secrets. Utah Territory is a land where God's voice is said to echo through the mountains, where prophets walk among the faithful, and where the line between divine revelation and human madness grows thinner with each passing winter. New Canaan, that's what they called their settlement, a name heavy with biblical promise, nestled in a valley so remote that the nearest neighbor was a 3-day ride through treacherous mountain passes. 47 souls called this place home, 47 believers who had followed their prophet, Josiah Whitmore, into the wilderness to build Zion on earth. Whitmore was not officially recognized by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was what the church leadership in Salt Lake City would have called a false prophet, a man who claimed direct revelation from God, who insisted that the true restoration required more radical obedience, more complete submission, more wives. But here's what makes your blood run cold. To his followers, Whitmore wasn't a false prophet. He was the only true voice of God they had ever heard. And when God speaks, through whatever vessel he chooses, faithful people listen, they obey, they sacrifice. Even when that sacrifice is their wives, even when that sacrifice is their daughters, even when that sacrifice is their own souls. Josiah Whitmore stood 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5. His eyes were the color of winter ice, and his voice could shake the timbers of their crude meetinghouse when he spoke of God's wrath. Born in Vermont in 1810, he had joined the Mormon movement early, drawn by Joseph Smith's promise of continuous revelation and the restoration of ancient truths. But Whitmore wanted more than restoration. He wanted dominion. After Smith's death in 1844, while Brigham Young led the main body of saints to Utah, Whitmore gathered a small group of the most devoted or, perhaps the most desperate, and led them deeper into the wilderness. Away from the watchful eyes of church authorities, away from the laws of man, away from anyone who might question what God was supposedly telling him to do. In New Canaan, Whitmore's word was law, his revelations were scripture, his hungers were holy commandments. And oh, how hungry Josiah Whitmore was. The practice of plural marriage polygamy was already controversial among the mainstream Mormon population, but Whitmore took it further. According to the testimonies we'll examine tonight, he claimed that God had revealed to him the doctrine of eternal sealing, a belief that certain men, certain prophets, were commanded to gather as many wives as possible to secure their place in the celestial kingdom. By 1857, Whitmore had taken 4 wives. Sarah, his first, was a gentlewoman from Ohio who had followed him since the early days. Rebecca, a widow with 3 children, had joined the group seeking protection and provision. Martha, barely 19, had been married to Whitmore in a ceremony that her own parents had blessed, believing they were ensuring their daughter's salvation. And then there was Elizabeth, sweet Elizabeth, who had just turned 16 that autumn. Elizabeth, who had been promised to Whitmore by her father in exchange for a better position in the settlement's hierarchy. Elizabeth, who had been married to the prophet in a secret ceremony that even the other wives had not been permitted to witness. What would you have done if you had been Sarah, watching your husband take younger and younger wives in the name of God? If you had been Rebecca, seeing your children grow up in a place where their mother's voice mattered less than a prophet's dreams? If you had been Martha, realizing that the salvation you'd been promised felt more like damnation with each passing day, would you have spoken out? Would you have tried to escape? Or would you have done what these women did, what faithful women have done throughout history when faced with the impossible choice between their conscience and their faith? The trouble began in the autumn of 1857. According to the Journal of Thomas Brennan, one of the settlement's elders, strange things started happening in the Whitmore household, sounds in the night, crying that couldn't be explained, arguments behind closed doors that would suddenly stop when others approached. Brennan wrote, "The prophets' wives have grown quiet. Where once they moved through the settlement with purpose and conversation, now they seem to drift like ghosts. Sister Sarah has taken to praying aloud at all hours. Sister Rebecca's children ask for their mother, but she seems not to hear them. Sister Martha has not been seen at communal meals for a week. And young Sister Elizabeth, God help us, but young Sister Elizabeth looks at us with eyes that hold no light." You have to understand the power dynamic at play here. In New Canaan, questioning the prophet was not just disobedience, it was apostasy. It was a sin that could damn your soul for eternity. And yet, even the most faithful began to whisper. They whispered about the locked room in Whitmore's cabin, where his wives would disappear for hours at a time. They whispered about the strange ceremonies that took place in the basement of the Meetinghouse, ceremonies that only Whitmore and his wives attended. They whispered about the wooden box that Whitmore kept in his study, a box that was said to contain sacred objects blessed by God himself. But whispers are just whispers, and in a community where divine revelation trumps human reason, whispers can be dismissed as doubt, as weakness, as the devil's temptation. Until the night of the 3rd of November, 1857, when Martha Whitmore ran screaming from the prophet's cabin into the settlement's main square. Thomas Brennan's journal entry from that night reads like a nightmare. Sister Martha came running from the prophet's dwelling, her dress torn, her face pale as death. She fell to her knees in the snow and began to speak words that I dare not repeat in full. She spoke of rituals, of sacrifices, of things done in the name of God that would make the angels weep. She spoke of the other wives, of what the prophet had demanded of them, of what they had been forced to endure in the name of celestial marriage. The men of the settlement gathered around Martha, trying to calm her, trying to understand, but before she could say more, Whitmore himself appeared. He stood in the doorway of his cabin, tall and imposing, his eyes fixed on his terrified wife. "Martha," he said, his voice carrying across the square like a judgment from on high, "you are unwell. You are seeing visions that are not from God. Come inside. We must pray together." "And here's what chills me to the bone," she went. Despite her terror, despite her obvious trauma, despite the fact that she had just fled from whatever horror awaited her in that cabin, she went back. Because when your prophet calls, you obey, even when obedience means walking back into hell itself. The next morning, Martha was nowhere to be found. Whitmore told the settlement that she had left in the night, that God had called her on a mission to the east. Her belongings were gone. Her bed was empty. And when the other wives were asked about her departure, they simply nodded and said that yes, the Lord had called Sister Martha away. But Thomas Brennan was not satisfied. That night, he wrote, "Something is wrong in the house of the prophet. The other wives move as if in a dream. They speak only when spoken to, and their words sound rehearsed, as if they have been practicing what to say. I fear for their souls. I fear for their lives." Brennan began to investigate quietly, carefully. He spoke to the children in the settlement, knowing that children often see truths that adults miss or choose to ignore. What he learned made his blood run cold. The children told him about the strange sounds coming from the prophet's cabin at night. Sounds like digging. Sounds like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Sounds like crying that would suddenly stop, as if cut off by force. They told him about the smell that sometimes drifted from the cabin's chimney knot, the clean scent of burning wood, but something else, something sweet and sick and wrong. They told him about the times they had seen the prophet's wives walking in the forest in single file, their faces blank, their movements mechanical, as if they were sleepwalking, or as if they were no longer entirely human? Do you believe in evil? Not the cartoonish evil of fairy tales, but the real thing, the kind that wears the mask of righteousness, that speaks in the language of faith, that turns devotion into destruction. As we delve deeper into this story, I want you to ask yourself, at what point does religious conviction become madness? At what point does obedience to a higher power become complicity in horror? Through careful investigation, Brennan discovered that Whitmore had been conducting what he called celestial sealings in the basement of the Meetinghouse. These were not the marriage ceremonies that the other members of the settlement had witnessed. These were something else entirely. According to Brennan's notes, which were found hidden in his cabin after his own mysterious disappearance, Whitmore believed that he had been called to perform what he termed the ultimate sacrifice, just as Abraham had been commanded to sacrifice Isaac. Whitmore claimed that God had commanded him to sacrifice his wives, not their lives, but their earthly forms, so that their souls could be perfectly purified for the celestial kingdom. The process, as Brennan described it, was elaborate and ritualistic. The wives would be brought to the basement, where Whitmore had constructed what he called the altar of transformation. There, in a ceremony that combined elements of Mormon temple rituals with practices that seemed to come from much darker sources, the women would be changed. I'm going to read you an excerpt from Brennan's journal, and I warn you, these words have haunted me since I first discovered them in the archives of the Utah Historical Society. The prophet speaks of transformation as if it were a blessing. He tells his wives that they are the chosen ones, that they will be the first to experience the glory of the celestial kingdom while still on earth. But what I witnessed through the basement window was not glory. It was an abomination. The women entered that basement as themselves. Sarah, Rebecca, Martha, Elizabeth, but what emerged were hollow shells, emptied of everything that made them human. They moved, they breathed. They spoke when spoken to, but their souls, dear God, their souls were gone. The winter of 1857 was the harshest in living memory. Snow fell for weeks without stopping, piling up against the cabins until some of the doors couldn't be opened. The settlement was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a white prison with their prophet and his increasingly strange wives. It was during this time that the other members of the settlement began to notice that they rarely saw Whitmore's wives anymore. The women who had once been active in the community, helping with cooking, caring for children, participating in worship services, had become phantoms, glimpsed only occasionally through frosted windows or walking silently through the snow. When concerned members of the settlement asked about the wives' absence, Whitmore would explain that they were engaged in sacred work that required their complete devotion. They were fasting and praying, he said, preparing for a great revelation that would soon be given to the entire community. But on the night of the 15th of December, 1857, everything changed. Thomas Brennan's final journal entry, dated the 16th of December, tells the story, "Last night, God help us all, I saw what the prophet has done. Unable to sleep, I walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered settlement. There, in the moonlight, I saw a procession moving through the forest. The prophet led, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the snow. Behind him walked his 4 wives, moving in perfect synchronization, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They disappeared into the trees, and God forgive me, but I followed. I stayed far enough behind to avoid detection, but close enough to see where they went. Deep in the forest, in a clearing I had never seen before, the prophet had constructed something that defies description, an altar of black stone, surrounded by symbols carved into the frozen ground. And there, in that unholy place, I witnessed the final act of Josiah Whitmore's madness. The women did not resist. They could not resist. Whatever the prophet had done to them in those basement rituals had stripped away their will, their humanity, their very souls. One by one they approached the altar. One by one they laid themselves down upon the stone, and one by one they simply vanished. Not killed, not harmed, but erased from existence as if they had never been. I watched in horror as Sarah, Rebecca, Martha, and Elizabeth, 4 women who had once been wives, mothers, daughters, human beings, were consumed by whatever darkness the prophet had summoned. They made no sound. They showed no fear. They simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the echo of their names in the cold mountain air. I am writing this by candlelight, my hands shaking so badly I can barely hold the pen. I know that I will not live to see morning. The prophet knows that I was there. He knows that I witnessed his ultimate blasphemy. Even now, I can hear footsteps in the snow outside my cabin. Even now, I can hear his voice calling my name. If anyone finds this journal, know this: Josiah Whitmore is not a prophet. He is something else entirely. Something that wears the mask of faith while serving powers that should not be named. The women did not deed would have been a mercy. They were taken somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the reach of God's light. Somewhere where their screams cannot be heard. He is coming for me now. I can hear him at the door. I can hear him speaking words that are not in any human language. God help me. God help us all. Thomas Brennan's body was found the next morning, frozen solid in his cabin. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure brought on by the extreme cold. His journal was never found, or, rather, it was found, but by people who understood the importance of keeping certain truths buried. When spring came and the snow melted, a supply caravan arrived at New Canaan to find the settlement in chaos. Half the residents had left in the night, fleeing into the wilderness rather than face whatever horror they had witnessed. The other half remained, but they were changed, hollow-eyed, haunted, speaking in whispers about dreams that felt more real than reality. Josiah Whitmore greeted the supply caravan with a smile and a blessing. When asked about his wives, he explained that they had been called by God to serve in the eastern states, that they had left before the worst of the winter storms. He showed the visitors their empty rooms, their missing belongings, their farewell letters written in handwriting that looked suspiciously similar to the prophet's own. The church authorities in Salt Lake City were informed of the situation, but they were dealing with their own problems: the Utah War, conflicts with the federal government, the struggle to establish legitimacy in a hostile nation. A remote settlement with a few missing women was not their highest priority. And so the official story was written. The 4 wives of Josiah Whitmore had left New Canaan in the early winter of 1857, traveling east to serve missions for the church. Their departure was voluntary, their destination unknown, their fate unimportant to the grand narrative of Mormon settlement in the West. But here's the thing about truth: it has a way of surviving. Even when institutions and individuals try to bury it, it survives in whispered stories passed down through generations. It survives in documents hidden in dusty archives. It survives in the collective memory of communities that witnessed horror and were told to forget. New Canaan was abandoned by 1860. The remaining residents scattered to other settlements, carrying with them stories they were forbidden to tell. Josiah Whitmore himself disappeared sometime in the winter of 1859, leaving behind only his empty cabin and the basement room where his celestial sealings had taken place. But the story didn't end there. It couldn't end there. Over the years, other disappearances were reported in the area. Women who had married men claiming to be prophets, children who had been promised to religious leaders in exchange for salvation, entire families who had followed charismatic leaders into the wilderness and were never seen again. The pattern was always the same: isolation, fanaticism, the gradual erosion of human will through religious manipulation, and then nothing. Empty cabins, missing people, official explanations that satisfied no one but were accepted by everyone because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Let me ask you something. How many other New Canaans were there? How many other Josiah Whitmores led faithful people into the wilderness, only to consume them in the name of God? How many women, children, families disappeared into the dark spaces between civilization and madness, their fates sealed by the very faith that was supposed to save them? Do you still believe that some secrets should stay buried? Or do you think that these stories, these terrible truths, need to be told not to attack faith itself, but to warn us about what happens when faith becomes fanaticism, when devotion becomes domination, when the search for God leads us into the arms of monsters? You might be wondering how we know these details, how these stories survived when so many people had reason to keep them secret. The answer lies in the courage of a few individuals who refused to let truth die, even when telling it put their own lives at risk. Sarah Brennan, Thomas's sister, had kept his journal hidden for 40 years before finally donating it to the Utah Historical Society in 1897. By then, She was an old woman. The Mormon church had gained respectability, and the wild frontier days seemed like ancient history. She thought it was finally safe to tell the truth. But even then, the journal was quietly buried in the archives, labeled as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and cold. It wasn't until 1987, when a graduate student named David Walsh was researching Mormon splinter groups, that the journal was rediscovered and its contents finally brought to light. Walsh spent 10 years tracking down descendants of the New Canaan settlement. He found court records, land deeds, personal letters, and family stories that had been passed down through generations. Slowly, piece by piece, he reconstructed the truth about what had happened in that remote valley in 1857. What he discovered was even more horrifying than Brennan's journal had suggested. The disappearances hadn't been limited to Whitmore's wives. Over the 3 years of New Canaan's existence, at least 15 women and children had vanished under mysterious circumstances. All of them had been connected to men who claimed special revelations from God. All of them had been involved in secret ceremonies that combined Mormon ritual with practices that seemed to come from much darker sources. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. Walsh's research suggested that New Canaan wasn't unique. He found evidence of similar disappearances in other isolated Mormon settlements throughout Utah Territory. Always the same pattern, always the same explanation, always the same official silence. It was as if something had been moving through the Mormon frontier, using faith as a weapon, using devotion as a tool for predation. Something that understood how to twist religious conviction into spiritual destruction. Something that may still be out there, waiting for the right combination of isolation, fanaticism, and faithful victims to begin its work again. Not everyone who encountered Josiah Whitmore disappeared. A few survivors lived to tell their stories, though they were often dismissed as liars, madmen, or apostates trying to attack the church. Mary Catherine Jensen was 8 years old when her family joined the New Canaan settlement. She and her parents left in the autumn of 1857, fleeing in the night after witnessing what she would later describe as the prophet's true face. In 1923, at the age of 74, she gave a deathbed testimony to her granddaughter that provides chilling insight into what life was like under Whitmore's rule. "He could make you forget yourself," she said. "When he looked at you, when he spoke to you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. But then you would see what he did to his wives, how they changed, how they became like dolls pretty to look at, but empty inside. My mother said we had to leave before he noticed me, before he decided that God wanted him to have a young wife." Another survivor, Jacob Morrison, had been one of Whitmore's most devoted followers until the night he was invited to witness a celestial sealing in the basement of the Meetinghouse. Morrison never spoke publicly about what he saw, but his personal diary, discovered after his death in 1903, provides a glimpse into the horror. "I cannot write what I witnessed. I cannot speak of it. I can only say that what the prophet calls God's work is something else entirely. The women who go into that basement are not the same women who come out. They move, they breathe, they speak when spoken to, but their souls, God in heaven, their souls are gone. I left New Canaan that very night, traveling through blizzards and over mountains that should have killed me, because I knew that staying would mean losing something far more precious than my life." But perhaps the most disturbing testimony comes from Rebecca Whitmore herself, or rather, from the thing that claimed to be Rebecca Whitmore. In 1901, a woman calling herself Rebecca appeared at the Salt Lake City Temple, claiming to be one of Josiah Whitmore's missing wives. She looked exactly as she had in 1857, not a day older, not a line on her face, not a grey hair on her head. She spoke in Rebecca's voice, knew Rebecca's memories, even had Rebecca's distinctive birthmark on her left hand. But the people who had known Rebecca before her disappearance said that something was wrong. The woman looked like Rebecca, sounded like Rebecca, but she felt empty, hollow, as if she were a perfect replica of a person, but with something essential missing. The church authorities questioned her extensively, but her story never changed. She claimed to have been serving a mission in the East, to have lost track of time, to have only recently realized that decades had passed. When pressed for details about her time away, she would simply smile and say that she had been in the service of the Lord, and that some experiences were too sacred to share. She stayed in Salt Lake City for exactly 1 week. Then, on a Sunday morning, she walked into the temple and was never seen again. The security guards swore she had never left the building, but a thorough search revealed nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Just like her sisters. Just like the other wives of Josiah Whitmore. So what really happened in New Canaan? What was the truth behind the disappearances, the rituals, the hollow-eyed women who moved like sleepwalkers through the snow? The answer, I believe, lies in understanding the dangerous intersection of religious fanaticism, isolation, and what we might call supernatural predation. Josiah Whitmore wasn't just a false prophet, was something far more sinister. He was a man who had learned to use faith as a weapon, devotion as a tool for domination, and religious ritual as a gateway to powers that should never be unleashed. The celestial sealings he performed weren't marriages, they were a form of spiritual harvesting. Through a combination of psychological manipulation, religious coercion, and rituals that drew from sources far older and darker than Mormon doctrine, Whitmore was able to literally consume the souls of his wives, leaving behind empty shells that could walk and talk and perform basic functions but were no longer truly alive. Think about it. How else do you explain women who disappeared without leaving footprints in the snow? How else do you explain the thing that claimed to be Rebecca Whitmore, unchanged after 44 years? How else do you explain the pattern of disappearances that followed similar prophets throughout the Mormon frontier? The truth is that faith, in its purest form, is a powerful force. It can move mountains, heal the sick, and transform lives. But like any powerful force, it can be corrupted, twisted, and used for purposes that are the opposite of divine. Josiah Whitmore discovered how to weaponize faith. He learned to turn devotion into domination, to use religious authority to break down the psychological barriers that protect the human soul. And once those barriers were down, once his victims were completely under his control, he could do whatever he wanted with them, including making them disappear forever. The story of New Canaan is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when we allow religious authority to go unchecked, when we mistake charisma for divinity, when we surrender our critical thinking in the name of faith. Throughout history, from the Salem witch trials to Jonestown to the Branch Davidians, we've seen what happens when isolated religious communities fall under the sway of charismatic leaders who claim direct communication with God. The pattern is always the same: isolation, indoctrination, the gradual erosion of individual will, and then tragedy. But New Canaan was different. The tragedy there wasn't death, it was something far worse. It was the complete erasure of human souls, the transformation of living people into hollow shells that could be manipulated at will. And here's what should terrify you. If it happened once, it can happen again. If Josiah Whitmore found a way to consume souls in the name of God, what's to stop another prophet from learning the same techniques? What's to stop another isolated religious community from falling under the sway of a predator who knows how to use faith as a weapon? The answer is vigilance. The answer is asking hard questions, even when those questions seem to challenge faith itself. The answer is remembering that true divinity never demands the complete surrender of human will, never requires the erasure of human dignity, never feeds on the destruction of human souls. You might think that the story of New Canaan is ancient history, that such things couldn't happen in our modern, connected world. But I want you to consider this. Isolation isn't just physical anymore. It's psychological, it's social, it's digital. Every day, people retreat into online communities where their beliefs are never challenged, where charismatic leaders can gain followers without ever meeting them face to face, where the gradual erosion of critical thinking can happen over months or years without anyone noticing. Every day, people surrender their autonomy to religious leaders, political figures, or social media influencers who promise them salvation, enlightenment, or belonging in exchange for complete obedience. Every day, people disappear not physically, but spiritually, psychologically, emotionally. They become hollow shells of themselves, living only to serve the agenda of whatever authority figure has gained control over their minds. The techniques that Josiah Whitmore used in 1857 are still being used today. The isolation, the indoctrination, the gradual breaking down of individual will, these are the tools of every cult leader, every authoritarian, every predator who uses faith or ideology to control others. The only difference is that now, instead of making people disappear into the wilderness, modern predators make them disappear into themselves. They create armies of hollow-eyed followers who will defend their leader against any criticism, who will surrender their money, their relationships, their very identity in service of a cause that serves no one but the person at the top. David Walsh's research into the New Canaan disappearances didn't end with the publication of his findings in 1997. If anything, it opened up new questions, new leads, new mysteries that demanded investigation. In 2003, Walsh organized an expedition to the site of the original New Canaan settlement. Using GPS coordinates derived from old survey maps and Thomas Brennan's journal, they were able to locate the remains of the buildings, including the basement where Whitmore's celestial sealings had taken place. What they found there defied explanation. The basement was perfectly preserved, as if it had been sealed in time. The symbols carved into the floor were still visible, their meaning unclear but their malevolent intent unmistakable. And in the center of the room, on what could only be described as an altar, they found 4 objects that chilled them to the bone. 4 wedding rings, 4 locks of hair, 4 photographs that showed Sarah, Rebecca, Martha, and Elizabeth Whitmore exactly as they had appeared in 1857. But here's the thing that made Walsh's blood run cold. The photographs were taken with technology that didn't exist in 1857. The paper was modern. The chemical processes were contemporary. According to experts at the Smithsonian, the photographs had been taken sometime in the 1990s, which means that somewhere, somehow, the 4 wives of Josiah Whitmore still exist, not as the living, breathing women they once were, but as something else. Something that can be photographed, something that can be documented, something that may still be wandering the earth, hollow shells of their former selves, waiting for their master to call them home. I want to tell you about the last piece of evidence that David Walsh discovered before his own disappearance in 2005. It was a letter, written in modern handwriting but signed with the name Josiah Whitmore. The letter was delivered to Walsh's office at the University of Utah, but security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the building at the time of delivery. The letter was brief, but its contents were chilling. Mr. Walsh, I understand you have been investigating the events at New Canaan. I commend your thoroughness and your dedication to uncovering the truth. However, I must warn you that some truths are too dangerous to be revealed. The work I began in 1857 was not completed with the transformation of my 4 wives. It was only the beginning. The techniques I developed, the rituals I perfected, the connection I established with forces beyond human understanding, these things continue to serve their purpose. My wives were not destroyed. They were perfected. They exist now in a state that transcends human limitation, free from the burdens of individual will, dedicated completely to the service of a higher power. They are my greatest achievement, my proof that faith, properly directed, can accomplish miracles that science cannot explain. I am offering you a choice, Mr. Walsh. You can continue your investigation and discover truths that will drive you mad, or you can accept that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Some secrets are too powerful to be exposed to the light of day. If you choose to continue, you will join my collection. You will become another testament to the power of absolute faith, another example of what human beings can become when they surrender completely to divine will. You will be transformed, just as my wives were transformed, into something pure and perfect and eternal. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. I am not a patient man, and my work must continue. With divine blessings, Josiah Whitmore. David Walsh was found dead in his office 3 days later. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who knew him said he had been in perfect health. His research notes were missing. His computer had been wiped clean, and on his desk, next to his body, was a single photograph showing 4 women in 1850s clothing, standing in what appeared to be a modern office building. The women were smiling, but their eyes were empty, hollow, dead. And so we returned to where we began. In the winter of 1857, 4 women vanished from a remote Mormon settlement in Utah Territory without leaving a single footprint in the snow. But now you know the truth. They didn't vanish. They were transformed. They were consumed. They were turned into something that exists in the spaces between life and death, between human and inhuman, between salvation and damnation. They are still out there somewhere, waiting for their master to call them home, waiting for new victims to join their ranks, waiting for the next isolated community, the next charismatic leader, the next group of faithful souls who mistake fanaticism for faith. The story of New Canaan is not ancient history. It is a contemporary warning. It is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it comes dressed as salvation. Sometimes it speaks in the language of faith. Sometimes it uses our deepest beliefs against us, turning our desire for meaning into a pathway to destruction. But the story doesn't end with David Walsh's death. If anything, his disappearance only confirmed what many researchers had begun to suspect, that the New Canaan incident was part of a larger pattern, a systematic campaign of spiritual predation that had been operating for over a century. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Chen began investigating similar disappearances throughout the American West. Her research, cut short by her own mysterious vanishing in 2012, revealed a network of isolated religious communities where charismatic leaders had claimed divine revelation and where women and children had disappeared under circumstances that defied explanation. The locations were scattered across Utah, Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona. The time periods ranged from the 1840s to the present day. But the pattern was always the same: a self-proclaimed prophet, a group of devoted followers, isolation from mainstream society, and then emptiness. Buildings left standing but abandoned, personal belongings left behind, people who had simply vanished without a trace. Before her disappearance, Chen had managed to interview several elderly individuals who claimed to be survivors of these communities. Their testimonies, now housed in a private collection that few researchers have been permitted to access, paint a picture of systematic spiritual abuse that goes far beyond anything documented in conventional historical records. They spoke of prophets who could look into your eyes and steal your will. They spoke of rituals that left participants changed, hollow, obedient. They spoke of a network of communication between these isolated communities, as if the various prophets were part of a larger organization, sharing techniques and resources. Most disturbing of all, they spoke of the gathering secret meetings where the prophets would bring their transformed followers together, creating armies of hollow-eyed devotees who would carry out their master's will without question or hesitation. You might wonder how such a network could operate in the modern age, how these techniques could be adapted for contemporary use. The answer lies in understanding that the fundamental vulnerabilities of human nature haven't changed. We still crave belonging. We still seek meaning. We still want to believe that somewhere, someone has the answers to life's most difficult questions. And predators like Josiah Whitmore understand these vulnerabilities better than their victims do. In 2015, FBI agents investigating a series of disappearances in rural communities across the Southwest uncovered evidence of what they called the New Canaan Network, a loose association of religious leaders who had been using updated versions of Whitmore's techniques to build followings and eliminate dissent. The investigation, classified and sealed from public view, reportedly revealed that these modern prophets had developed sophisticated methods for psychological manipulation, combining traditional cult indoctrination techniques with what can only be described as supernatural enhancement. The agents' reports, leaked to a small number of researchers, described encounters with individuals who appeared to be human but displayed no signs of independent thought or will. They moved in perfect synchronization, responded to commands instantaneously, and showed no reaction to physical pain or emotional trauma. In other words, they had been transformed into the same kind of hollow shells that Thomas Brennan had described in his journal over a century and a half earlier. But the reach of this network extends far beyond the American West. Researchers working in secret, afraid to publish their findings for fear of joining the ranks of the disappeared, have documented similar patterns in isolated religious communities around the world. In the mountains of Peru, entire villages have been found empty, their residents vanished without explanation. In the forests of Romania, Orthodox monasteries have been discovered abandoned, their monks missing but their cells left perfectly organized, as if the occupants had simply evaporated. In the deserts of Australia, Aboriginal communities have reported encounters with white spirits who speak in ancient languages and lead people into the wilderness, never to return. In the Highlands of Scotland, rural churches have been found empty, their congregations missing, but their hymnals still open to the pages they had been singing when they disappeared. The pattern is always the same. The technique is always the same. The result is always the same. Somewhere, in places hidden from public view, there are thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of individuals who were once human but have been transformed into something else. Something that serves without question, obeys without hesitation, and exists without will. And at the center of this network, pulling the strings, commanding the hollow army he has created over more than a century and a half, is the man who started it all. Josiah Whitmore, the prophet, the predator, the creature that feeds on faith and grows stronger with each soul it consumes. So I ask you again, do you still believe some secrets should stay buried? Do you still think that faith by itself is enough to protect you from the darkness that wears the mask of salvation? The story of New Canaan is not just history, it is prophecy. It is a warning about what happens when we mistake charisma for divinity, when we surrender our critical thinking in the name of spiritual enlightenment, when we allow our deepest needs to be weaponized against us. Right now, as you listen to these words, there are communities forming around charismatic leaders who claim to have special knowledge, special revelation, special connection to the divine. Right now, there are people who are being slowly, systematically stripped of their individuality, their will, their very souls. Right now, somewhere in the darkness, Josiah Whitmore is still working, still gathering, still transforming the faithful into the hollow. And he's looking for you. He's looking for people who are searching for meaning, for belonging, for answers to life's most difficult questions. He's looking for people who are willing to surrender their autonomy in exchange for the promise of eternal salvation. He's looking for people who are just faithful enough to be destroyed by their own faith. The choice that David Walsh was offered, the choice between ignorance and transformation, is a choice that faces all of us. In a world where information is power and truth is dangerous, we must decide whether to look away from the darkness or to stare into it, knowing that it might stare back. The easy path is denial. The comfortable path is dismissal. The safe path is to convince ourselves that stories like New Canaan are just that, stories. Fiction. The product of overactive imaginations and too much time spent in dusty archives. But the truth is that evil is real. Predation is real. The systematic destruction of human souls is real. And it's happening right now, in places we can't see, to people we'll never meet, by creatures who have learned to use our deepest beliefs against us. The question is not whether you believe in the supernatural aspects of this story. The question is whether you understand the very real human truths it reveals. The question is whether you can recognize the warning signs of spiritual predation. The question is whether you can protect yourself and others from those who would use faith as a weapon. I want to tell you how I came to know this story, why I've spent years researching the disappearances, why I've devoted my life to understanding the truth about New Canaan. My great-great-grandmother was Sarah Whitmore, the first wife, the one who walked into that forest clearing on a winter night in 1857 and was consumed by whatever darkness her husband had summoned. I found her journal hidden in my family's attic, along with letters from other family members who had been trying to find her for decades. The official family history said she had died of pneumonia in 1858, but the truth was more complicated. The truth was that she had vanished, along with her sister wives, leaving behind only memories and the terrible knowledge that something monstrous had been done in the name of God. For years, I told myself that I was researching this story for historical purposes, to set the record straight, to honor the memory of the women who had disappeared, to understand the darker chapters of American religious history. But I was lying to myself. I was researching this story because I could feel it calling to me, because I could sense that somewhere, in the spaces between life and death, my great-great-grandmother was still out there, still waiting, still serving a master who had consumed her soul and turned her into something that was no longer human. And I was researching this story because I could feel him calling to me too, Josiah Whitmore, the prophet, the predator, the creature that had destroyed my family and countless others. 3 weeks ago, I received a letter, modern paper, contemporary ink, but written in a handwriting style that belonged to the 19th century. The letter was brief. My dear descendant, I have been watching your research with great interest. Your dedication to uncovering the truth about your family's history is admirable. Your great-great-grandmother was a remarkable woman, devoted, faithful, obedient. She serves me still, along with her sister wives, in a capacity that transcends human understanding. I am writing to offer you the same choice I offered Mr. Walsh. You can continue your research and discover truths that will drive you to madness, or you can accept my invitation to join your ancestor in eternal service. The transformation is painless. The existence is peaceful. You will be reunited with your family member, and you will serve a purpose greater than any you could achieve in your current, limited state. I await your decision, but I will not wait long. The letter was signed Josiah Whitmore and dated yesterday. So, now you know why I'm telling you this story, why I'm recording this narration, why I'm putting this information out into the world, even though I know it will put me in danger. Because I'm making my choice. I'm choosing truth over safety. I'm choosing to warn others, even if it means joining the ranks of the disappeared. I'm choosing to complete the work that David Walsh started and Sarah Chen continued. I'm choosing to tell you that the story of New Canaan is not just history. It is a present danger. It is a warning about what happens when we allow our faith to be weaponized against us. It is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it comes dressed as salvation. Sometimes it speaks in the language of faith. Sometimes it uses our deepest beliefs to destroy us from within. And now I'm asking you to make a choice. You can dismiss this story as fiction, as the product of an overactive imagination, as an elaborate hoax designed to frighten and mislead. You can go back to your normal life, your comfortable assumptions, your safe beliefs, or you can accept that there are forces in this world that feed on faith, that consume souls, that transform human beings into hollow shells of their former selves. You can accept that these forces are still active, still hunting, still gathering new victims. You can accept that somewhere, in the darkness, Josiah Whitmore is still working, still building his army of the faithful, still turning devotion into destruction. The women who disappeared from New Canaan were not just statistics. They were not just victims. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, wives. They were human beings with dreams, hopes, fears, and aspirations. They were people who deserved better than to be consumed by a monster who used their faith against them. Sarah Whitmore was a teacher before she married the prophet. She had wanted to open a school for girls, to give young women the education they needed to make their own choices in life. Rebecca Whitmore was a midwife who had delivered dozens of babies in her community. She had saved lives, brought new life into the world, served as a healer and helper to everyone who needed her. Martha Whitmore was an artist who painted beautiful landscapes of the Utah wilderness. Her paintings were said to capture not just the physical beauty of the landscape, but the spiritual peace that came from communion with nature. Elizabeth Whitmore was a poet who wrote verses about love, loss, and the search for meaning in a difficult world. Her poems were shared throughout the settlement, bringing comfort to those who struggled with doubt and despair. These women were not just victims. They were individuals with unique gifts, unique contributions to make to the world. They were silenced not by death, but by something worse, by the complete erasure of their humanity, their individuality, their souls. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be honored, not as the hollow shells they became, but as the vibrant, living human beings they once were. In the winter of 1857, 4 women vanished from a remote Mormon settlement in Utah Territory without leaving a single footprint in the snow. But now you know the truth. They didn't vanish. They were transformed. They were consumed. They were turned into something that exists in the spaces between salvation and damnation, between human and inhuman, between the living and the dead. They are still out there, somewhere, waiting in the darkness, waiting for their master to call them home, waiting for new victims to join their ranks, waiting for the next group of faithful souls who will mistake fanaticism for faith. The story of New Canaan is not over. It will never be over. As long as there are people who seek meaning, who crave belonging, who want to believe that somewhere, someone has the answers to life's most difficult questions, there will be predators like Josiah Whitmore ready to exploit those needs. As long as there are isolated communities where charismatic leaders can operate without oversight, there will be opportunities for spiritual predation on a massive scale. As long as we fail to recognize the warning signs, fail to ask the hard questions, fail to maintain our critical thinking in the face of religious authority, there will be new victims, new disappearances, new transformations. The women of New Canaan are gone, but their story remains, their warning remains, their call for justice remains. They are speaking to you now, through the darkness, through the years, through the terrible silence that has surrounded their fate for over a century and a half. They are telling you to be vigilant, to be skeptical, to question authority, even when that authority claims to speak for God. They are telling you that true faith never demands the surrender of human will, that true spirituality never requires the destruction of human dignity, that true divinity never feeds on the consumption of human souls. In the winter of 1857, 4 women vanished from a remote Mormon settlement in Utah Territory without leaving a single footprint in the snow. Tonight, as you go to sleep, remember their names, remember their stories, remember their warning. And remember that somewhere, in the darkness, Josiah Whitmore is still working, still gathering, still transforming the faithful into the hollow, still waiting for you to make your choice. The choice is yours, but choose wisely, choose quickly. Some secrets should stay buried, but some truths must be told, even when telling them costs us everything. In memory of Sarah, Rebecca, Martha, and Elizabeth Whitmore, and all those who have been lost to the darkness that wears the mask of faith, may their stories serve as a warning to future generations. May their sacrifice not be in vain.